In the heart of the New Mexico Territory in the year 1865, a child was born who would one day face 4,000 bullets and survive. His name was Elfego Baca. Back then, the land was wild, not just in name, but in truth. There were no laws strong enough to protect the innocent, and no men brave enough to stand against injustice. Violence was everywhere. Gunshots echoed across the dusty towns, and fear ruled more than the law did. Elfego came into this world in a small place called Socorro, a town surrounded by dry hills, silent deserts, and people just trying to live another day. He was born to Francisco and Juana Maria Baca, a humble Mexican-American family who worked hard to survive the chaos of the Old West. Life was tough, but so were the people. And Elfego was tougher than most, even as a boy, from a young age. Elfego noticed something that never left his heart. People like his family, Hispanic settlers, farmers and laborers, were treated as less than others. When cowboys or lawmen came through town, they didn't show respect. They shouted, threatened, and sometimes killed. And nobody did anything about it. Elfego watched his father keep his head down. He saw neighbors beaten for speaking Spanish. He saw mothers cry for justice that never came. And deep inside, he made a quiet promise to himself. One day, I'll make sure the law protects everyone and not just the powerful. He wasn't big, but he had something rarer than muscle: fearless determination. While other boys played games, Elfego studied people. He watched how men acted when danger came. He learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the strength to stand your ground even when fear was all around you. New Mexico in the 1870s wasn't a safe place. The territory was still untamed, filled with outlaws, cattle thieves, and gunfighters who answered to no one. It was a land where justice came from the barrel of a gun, and men lived by their own rules. The American government was still struggling to bring order to this new frontier. But in small towns like Socorro, that order barely existed. Sheriffs were few, judges were corrupt, and money spoke louder than truth. So when Elfego looked around, he saw two kinds of people: those who used power to hurt others, and those who suffered silently. And he knew exactly which side he'd be on. As Elfego grew older, stories of famous lawmen and gunfighters spread across the land. Names like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, and Billy the Kid. But Elfego wasn't impressed by fame. He was interested in fairness. He wanted to bring dignity to the Mexican people, people who spoke his language, who worked hard, and who deserved the same respect as anyone else. By the time he was in his teens, Elfego had already developed a sharp mind and a calm presence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He was polite but strong-willed. He learned English quickly, not to fit in, but to fight back, with words, not just fists. Still, he knew that in the Wild West, words alone were never enough. Sometimes justice had to speak through action. When Elfego turned 19, he left home with a clear purpose. He wasn't looking for fame or money. He was looking for justice. He made his way to Frisco, New Mexico, a rough, lawless mining town filled with saloons, cowboys, and trouble. Frisco was known as a place where bullets decided arguments and laws were ignored. Drunken cowboys from Texas often rode in, shooting in the air, terrorizing families, and treating locals like prey. For most people, Frisco was a town to avoid. But for Elfego Baca, it was a place to make a stand. In those days, the sheriff's office had no real control over Frisco. The people were desperate for someone brave enough to take charge. Elfego decided he didn't need anyone's permission to act. He took it upon himself to become a deputy, pinning a star-shaped badge to his chest. Not because anyone gave it to him, but because he believed someone had to protect the innocent. That act alone made him different. It made him dangerous. Elfego didn't have an army. He didn't have backup. What he had was belief. Belief that courage and justice could still mean something, even in a world gone mad. As he walked through the streets of Frisco for the first time, dust swirling at his boots, people watched in silence. They saw a young man with dark eyes, a firm stance, and a quiet confidence. He wasn't there to pick a fight, but he wasn't afraid of one either. That night, the saloon roared with drunken laughter and gunfire. Cowboys stumbled through the street, shooting their pistols at the stars. Families hid in their homes. And Elfego Baca stepped out into the street, alone. He had no idea that this small act of courage, this decision, to bring order to one wild town, would soon lead to one of the most incredible gunfights in American history, a gunfight that would make his name echo across generations. A story that would prove one thing beyond doubt. Elfego Baca was the man who couldn't be killed. In 1884, the town of Frisco, New Mexico was more like a battlefield than a town. It was loud, rough, and ruled by fear. Cowboys rode in from Texas, drunk and proud, waving guns in the air, shooting for fun, and leaving chaos behind. The townspeople hid behind their doors, afraid to speak, afraid to look. No lawman dared to stop them, until a young man named Elfego Baca arrived. He was only 19, but his eyes showed no fear. He had already seen what injustice looked like, and he wasn't about to let it spread any further. When Elfego walked into Frisco, most people thought he was crazy. The sheriff barely had control, and even the soldiers avoided trouble there. But Elfego didn't come for fame or reward. He came because someone had to. The story began on a dusty afternoon when a group of drunken cowboys stormed into the town. They shot their pistols into the sky, laughing wildly. One of them, a man named Charlie McCarty, rode his horse straight into the center of town, firing at random, nearly hitting a child who was playing nearby. The people froze. Nobody dared to stop him. Nobody except Elfego. Elfego walked calmly into the street, his revolver holstered but ready. He called out to McCarty, telling him to drop his gun and come quietly. The cowboy laughed in his face. He didn't believe this small young man could do anything. He cursed, raised his gun, and pointed it at Elfego. But Elfego was faster. In a blink, his pistol was out. The bullet hit McCarty's arm, and the gun fell to the ground. The other cowboys stared in disbelief. Elfego didn't shoot to kill. He shot to control. He marched McCarty to the small adobe jailhouse and locked him inside. The people of Frisco watched from their windows, whispering. For the first time, someone had stood up to the bullies who ruled their town. But that act of courage lit a fire that couldn't be put out. When the rest of the cowboys found out what happened, their pride turned to rage. They couldn't accept that one man, especially a Mexican-American, had dared to arrest one of their own. They gathered their horses, their rifles, and their anger. Word spread fast. Around 80 men were coming back to Frisco to kill Elfego Baca and take revenge. That evening, the air in Frisco was thick with tension. The townspeople hid again, whispering prayers. Elfego stood alone in the sheriff's office, reloading his weapon, calm but ready. He wasn't running. He never did. He looked out at the darkening sky and said quietly, "If they want to fight, they'll find me waiting." When the cowboys arrived, they came like a storm. Dozens of horses thundered through the town. The sound of hooves echoed off the wooden walls. Shouts filled the air. "Bring out that deputy," one man yelled. "We'll hang him before sunrise." Elfego knew he couldn't face all of them head-on. So he moved quickly to a small adobe house at the edge of town. It belonged to a local friend who offered him shelter. The walls were thick, made of packed clay and stone, and it was the only place where he could make a stand. Inside, Elfego set up his rifle by the window and waited. The first shot came at sunset. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the air outside exploded with gunfire. Bullets slammed into the walls, sending clouds of dust flying inside the room. But Elfego didn't panic. He waited for the right moments. When he saw movement through the smoke, he fired back. Calm, steady, accurate. Hours passed, and the shooting didn't stop. The cowboys shouted insults, daring him to come out. But Elfego didn't move. The house shook under the storm of bullets, but the thick adobe walls held strong. Inside, Elfego reloaded, counted his rounds, and whispered to himself, "They can shoot all they want. I'm not leaving." By the next morning, the ground outside was littered with spent shells. The cowboys had fired hundreds of rounds, but Elfego was still alive. Not a single bullet had hit him. When they tried to rush the house, he met them with sharp, quick shots that dropped several attackers. Each time they tried to get closer, he pushed them back. The fight turned into a siege. By the second day, it was said that the cowboys had fired more than 4,000 bullets. The house looked like it had been through a war. Holes pocked the walls, the door hung loose, and the windows were shattered. But inside, Elfego remained unharmed. His calm never broke. The men outside began to whisper. They said he had magic. Others said he was protected by God. But the truth was simpler. Elfego Baca was brave, clever, and patient. He didn't waste a single bullet. He didn't give up, not even when outnumbered 100 to 1. By the third day, the cowboys were exhausted. They had run out of ammunition, food, and courage. What started as a revenge mission turned into a nightmare. They couldn't believe one man had held them off for so long. Finally, they began to retreat, dragging their wounded and counting their dead. When the smoke cleared, Elfego stepped outside. He was covered in dust, but alive and proud. The townspeople came out slowly, staring in disbelief. He had survived the impossible. They began to call him something that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man who couldn't be killed. That day, Elfego Baca became more than a deputy. He became a symbol, a living legend. And though the battle was over, his real journey as a lawman had only just begun. When the gunfire finally stopped, silence filled the town of Frisco. Smoke drifted across the street. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, and the people peeked out from their doors in disbelief. The young deputy, Elfego Baca, had done the impossible. He had faced down an army of cowboys, survived thousands of bullets, and walked away without a scratch. But the story wasn't finished yet. The battle might have ended, but the war for justice was just beginning. Elfego stood outside the bullet-riddled adobe house, his hat low, his rifle still in his hands. The walls behind him looked like honeycombs, filled with holes where bullets had struck but never reached him. He was tired, hungry, and dirty, but when the townspeople gathered around him, all they saw was courage. One woman whispered, "God must have protected him." Another man said, "No, it wasn't God, it was his will." As word spread across New Mexico, people began traveling miles just to see the house where the young lawman had made his stand. They wanted to meet the man who couldn't be killed. Newspapers called him the hero of Frisco, and even those who once doubted him now spoke his name with respect. But fame brought trouble too. The cowboys who had failed to kill him weren't done with revenge. They wanted him punished, not celebrated. Soon they pushed for his arrest, claiming he had murdered their friends during the fight. Elfego didn't run. He didn't hide. When the warrant came, he handed over his gun and walked calmly to the jailhouse. He knew what was coming next, a trial that could end his life. The courtroom was packed. Ranchers, miners, cowboys, and townsfolk all came to see the man who had defied death. Some came to cheer him. Others came to see him fall. The prosecutors called him a murderer. They said he had killed without mercy, that he had provoked the gunfight. They painted him as a reckless vigilante who thought he was above the law. But Elfego sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, his dark eyes steady. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and told the jury the truth. He told them about the chaos in Frisco, the innocent people who lived in fear, and how no one else had dared to stop the drunken cowboys. He explained that he had arrested McCarty to protect the town, not to start a fight. Then he looked at the judge and said something that the crowd would never forget. "I didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble came to me. And when it did, I stood my ground." His words echoed through the courtroom. Even those who doubted him felt the power of his honesty. Witnesses took the stand, including townspeople who swore that Elfego had defended himself and never shot first. They described how bullets rained down on the small house and how Baca stayed calm, returning fire only when he had to. After days of testimony, the jury disappeared to make their decision. The wait felt endless. The crowd whispered and fidgeted. Then, after hours, the foreman stood and announced the verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Elfego Baca smiled slightly, nodded to the judge, and walked out into the sunlight a free man. He had faced death, faced the law, and won both battles. But Elfego wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about what came next. The Wild West was still lawless, and he had seen too much injustice to stop now. He knew that if one man could make a difference in Frisco, maybe he could do the same for the rest of New Mexico. So instead of leaving town or retiring in peace, Elfego decided to dedicate his life to law and order. He wanted to prove that justice didn't belong only to the rich or the powerful. It belonged to everyone. He began working as a sheriff, taking charge of towns that others were too afraid to enter. He didn't use fear to control people. He used respect. He listened to the poor, helped the weak, and stood up to anyone who thought they could abuse power. People soon learned that if Elfego Baca was in town, peace followed. Yet danger never left his side. He had made enemies, men who couldn't forget their humiliation at Frisco. Some tried to ambush him, others sent threats, but each time Elfego came out alive. It was as if fate itself was protecting him. People joked that he had 9 lives, and soon newspapers began calling him the 9-lived lawman. Despite his growing reputation, Elfego remained humble. He often said, "I never wanted to kill anyone. I only wanted people to stop being afraid." By now, his name had become a symbol of justice for Mexican Americans across the Southwest. In an era when many were treated as second-class citizens, Elfego's courage gave them hope. He showed that dignity and bravery could stand against prejudice and power. Years later, when someone asked him how he survived the Frisco siege, Elfego laughed softly and said, "I stayed small, kept low, and believed God still had work for me." The legend of Elfego Baca began with that first gunfight. But it was his heart, his belief in fairness and respect, that made him unforgettable. The bullets had missed him, but they had shaped him. From that day forward, he wasn't just a survivor. He was a man on a mission, to bring real law to a land that had forgotten what it meant. And though he had won his freedom, Elfego knew the frontier still had many battles waiting. He holstered his gun, put on his badge, and rode toward the next town in need of order, ready to face whatever storm came next. The years after the Frisco gunfight turned Elfego Baca into more than just a man. He became a legend. His name spread across New Mexico like wildfire. People spoke of him with pride and awe, telling stories that grew taller with every retelling. Some said he had stopped 100 cowboys. Others swore the bullets had passed right through his clothes without touching his skin. Whether the stories were true or not, one thing was certain. Elfego Baca had proven that courage could still exist in a lawless land. But while most men would have used such fame to seek comfort or glory, Elfego didn't slow down. The fight in Frisco had given him purpose. He had seen what fear did to people, and he refused to let it win again. The Wild West was still dangerous, full of men who thought the law didn't apply to them. And Elfego decided to spend his life changing that. After his acquittal, he continued working as a lawman, taking on jobs no one else wanted. Many towns in the New Mexico territory were little more than collections of saloons, gambling halls, and dusty roads ruled by outlaws. But when word spread that Elfego Baca was coming, those same outlaws often vanished before he arrived. His reputation was stronger than any weapon he carried. People believed he couldn't be killed, and that belief alone was enough to keep the peace. Yet Elfego never used fear to control others. He treated people with fairness. When he entered a saloon, the noise usually stopped, not because he shouted or drew his gun, but because he carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't act like a hero. He acted like a man who knew what was right. But peace never lasted long in the West. One evening, while Elfego was serving as a deputy sheriff in another rough mining town, a gang of cattle thieves tried to start trouble. They thought they could intimidate him the same way they had frightened every other lawman. They were wrong. Elfego faced them alone, unflinching. The leader of the gang laughed and said, "You think that star makes you special, Baca?" "Out here, the law don't mean nothing." Elfego stared at him and replied softly, "It means something to me." When the man reached for his gun, Elfego drew first. The echo of that single shot silenced the entire room. The others dropped their weapons and surrendered without another word. From that day on, people said that even the sound of Elfego's voice could end a fight. But Elfego didn't rely on violence to earn respect. He used his mind as much as his gun. He studied the law, learning everything he could about legal rights, court procedures, and justice. He began helping people who were wrongly accused, especially Mexican Americans who had no one to defend them. It was rare for someone like him to become a lawyer in those days, but Elfego had never cared about what was expected. When he finally passed the bar exam and became an attorney, many were shocked. The same man who had once faced an army of cowboys now stood in courtrooms, defending the innocent with words instead of bullets. He was known for his sharp arguments and his deep sense of fairness. If someone was guilty, he told them straight. But if someone was being punished just because of their race or background, he fought like a lion to protect them. In one case, a young Mexican man was accused of stealing cattle, a crime that could have ended in hanging. No one wanted to represent him. The evidence was thin, but prejudice was strong. Elfego took the case and uncovered the truth. The rancher had lied to cover his own theft. The jury acquitted the boy, and Elfego's reputation as a lawyer grew just as strong as his fame as a gunfighter. He was no longer just the man who couldn't be killed. He was now the man who couldn't be defeated. Still, not everyone liked seeing a Mexican-American man rise to power in a place where most laws were written by others. Many tried to discredit him. Some even plotted to remove him from office. But Elfego didn't back down. He said, "If the law belongs only to the rich, then it isn't law, it's tyranny." That belief guided every decision he made. Whether as a sheriff, a lawyer, or later as a district attorney, Elfego stood firm. He was tough but fair, feared but respected. He wasn't interested in fame or politics. He was interested in justice. But being a hero in the Wild West came with a cost. His constant battles left him weary. He missed the simplicity of his early years, the sound of quiet mornings in Socorro, the peace before the chaos. Still, he knew he could never go back. The frontier needed men like him, men who refused to look away when others were suffering. One night, sitting by the fire with a close friend, Elfego was asked why he risked his life so many times when he could have walked away. He smiled and said, "Because someone has to remind this world that courage still matters." That simple answer carried the weight of everything he had lived through. The gunfights, the trials, the sleepless nights, they all meant something. They were the price he paid for believing in a better world. As the years passed, Elfego became more than a lawman. He became a legend told in every corner of New Mexico, a story of courage that parents told their children before bed. Some called him stubborn, others called him blessed. But everyone agreed on one thing. Elfego Baca was the kind of man you only meet once in a lifetime, and while many gunfighters of the West faded into history, his name continued to grow, not because he killed, but because he stood for something greater than himself. Elfego Baca had survived the bullets. Now he was surviving time itself, one story, one memory, one legend at a time. Elfego Baca's fame spread across New Mexico faster than a desert storm. Everyone knew his name, the man who had faced 80 cowboys, survived 4,000 bullets, and walked away untouched. Newspapers called him a living legend. To the people of New Mexico, he was more than that. He was proof that courage, not bloodline or skin color, could make a hero. But for Elfego, fame didn't mean rest. He never saw himself as a hero. He was simply doing what he believed was right. The world around him was still broken, and he knew justice didn't come easy in the Wild West. The Frisco gunfight had made him famous, but it had also made him a target. There were men who envied him, men who feared him, and men who wanted him dead. Instead of hiding, Elfego kept moving. He worked as a deputy sheriff in one county after another, cleaning up towns that were drowning in corruption. Wherever he went, he brought order. Outlaws ran at the sound of his name, and honest people found hope again. He never needed to brag. His calmness was his power. One story tells of a group of criminals who had been terrorizing a small town near Socorro. They robbed travelers, stole cattle, and threatened anyone who tried to stop them. When Elfego arrived, the gang expected another frightened deputy. But when he walked into their saloon, everything changed. He didn't raise his voice or draw his gun. He simply said, "I hear you've been stealing from good people." That ends today. The room went quiet. The gang leader, a man twice Elfego's size, laughed and reached for his weapon. In a flash, Elfego's revolver was out, aimed straight at the man's chest. "Go ahead," Elfego said. "If you think you can beat me, try." No one moved. The outlaw slowly lowered his hand. Within minutes, the gang gave up their weapons and left town. No one had been shot. Elfego's courage alone had done the job. As years passed, Elfego began thinking beyond gunfights. He saw how often poor families lost their land because they couldn't read English or understand the law. He decided that if he really wanted to change things, he needed to fight not just with bullets, but with knowledge. So he studied law. He spent long nights reading by lamplight, learning every detail he could. People mocked him at first. "What does a gunfighter know about law?" they asked. But Elfego didn't care. He had always believed that the law should protect everyone, not just those with money or power. After years of studying, he passed the bar exam and became one of the few Mexican-American lawyers in the entire territory. In court, he was as fearless as he had been in the streets. When he spoke, juries listened. His words were simple but powerful. He didn't use fancy language. He spoke from the heart, and when he defended someone, he did it with the same passion that had kept him alive in Frisco. He once defended a poor farmer accused of murder. Everyone thought the man was guilty because of his heritage and his silence. But Elfego uncovered the truth. The killing had been done by the victim's own partner. His investigation saved the farmer's life and revealed corruption that reached deep into the town's leadership. From that day, people said Elfego didn't just fight for justice, he exposed it. His success in court made him both respected and hated. Powerful men who used the law for their own gain began to fear him. He couldn't be bribed, and he couldn't be intimidated. Whenever someone tried to threaten him, Elfego would just smile and say, "You can shoot at me if you like, but I've been shot at before." Even as a lawyer, danger followed him everywhere. There were attempts on his life, but none succeeded. One night, while traveling to a neighboring town, an ambush was set for him on the road. When the shots rang out, Elfego dove from his horse and fired back into the darkness. By the time the smoke cleared, the attackers were gone. Once again, he walked away without injury. People began to believe that something supernatural protected him. Some said he carried a charm. Others whispered that the bullets simply refused to touch him. But Elfego always laughed when he heard those tales. "The only magic I have," he said, "is courage and good aim." As he grew older, his role in New Mexico continued to evolve. He became a district attorney, then a political leader, using his position to improve education and equality. He pushed for schools that welcomed Hispanic children, fought against unfair taxes, and helped shape the foundation of what would become modern New Mexico. Even as a politician, Elfego kept his straightforward honesty. He once told a group of officials, "A law is only good if it protects the weak as much as it protects the strong." That was his guiding principle. No matter how high he climbed, he never forgot where he came from. He remembered the fear in the eyes of his people when he was a boy in Socorro, and he made sure they would never have to feel powerless again. By this time, Elfego Baca was more than a man. He was a symbol. In towns across the Southwest, his story became a source of pride. To the Mexican-American community, he represented hope and strength. To Lawman, he represented courage. And to outlaws, he was a reminder that no one could escape justice forever. But behind all the fame and power, Elfego remained humble. He never sought wealth. He lived simply, often giving his money to those who needed it more. When people asked why he worked so hard, he would say, "Because peace is worth fighting for." The legend of the Frisco gunfight might have made him famous, but it was his heart that made him unforgettable. Every time he put on his badge or stood before a judge, he carried the same purpose that had guided him since he was a boy, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And even as the Old West began to fade into history, Elfego Baca's name stayed alive, whispered in saloons, written in newspapers, and passed down through generations. The man who couldn't be killed had become something even greater, a man who would never be forgotten. The years rolled on, and the world around Elfego Baca began to change. The Wild West that had once been filled with dust, gun smoke, and lawlessness was slowly giving way to towns, schools, and order. But Elfego never changed. He remained as firm and fearless as ever, a man who carried both a badge and a purpose. By now, he had lived through things most men couldn't imagine. He had faced armies of outlaws, survived ambushes, stood in courtrooms against the powerful, and spoken up for the weak. Yet somehow he never lost his balance. He still carried the same quiet confidence that had kept him alive during the Frisco siege. People across New Mexico admired him, but they also wondered how one man could keep escaping death. Some said he was blessed. Others said he was simply too stubborn to die. Elfego would just smile and say, "If your cause is right, fear can't kill you." Even as he grew older, danger didn't leave him alone. There were still those who wanted him gone, people who hated his courage or feared his influence. Once, while serving as a U.S. Marshal, he arrested a powerful ranch owner accused of land theft and murder. The man's family threatened him, warning that he'd never live to see another sunrise. Elfego went home that night, lit a cigar, and slept peacefully. The next morning, he walked out his front door, met the same men who had threatened him, and greeted them with a nod. "If you're going to kill me," he said, "at least let me finish my coffee first." They backed down. They always did. But Elfego's greatest battles were no longer fought with guns. They were fought with ideas. He wanted his people to rise, to be treated with respect, to have opportunities beyond survival. He believed education was the real weapon against injustice. So he began using his position to help establish schools and fair courts throughout the territory. He became involved in politics, though he never truly fit the mold of a politician. He didn't flatter, didn't lie, and didn't bend. When he ran for office, his campaign was simple. I stand for the truth, and I stand for you. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. The people trusted him because they knew he meant every word. As a leader, Elfego refused to be silent in the face of corruption. He confronted dishonest officials, exposed schemes, and reminded others that public service was about duty, not wealth. Many tried to discredit him, but none succeeded. He had lived too honestly for anyone to twist his story. Still, even as he worked in government, the spirit of the old gunfighter never left him. He carried the same revolver that had saved his life in Frisco, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder. Every time he saw it, he remembered where he came from, a poor boy from Socorro who dared to stand against injustice. When no one else would, his life became a bridge between two worlds, the dying Wild West and the growing civilization that replaced it. He represented the courage of the past and the hope of the future. And through it all, he kept his humor. When people asked him how many times he had been shot at, he'd laugh and say, "More than I can count, but not enough to hit me." Even in his later years, Elfego remained active. He gave speeches, telling stories of his battles not to boast, but to inspire. He reminded young people that heroes didn't have to be born strong. They only needed to be brave enough to do what was right. He often said, "The world doesn't need perfect men, just honest ones." But beneath the laughter and wisdom, there were signs of exhaustion. The years of danger, travel, and endless responsibility had taken their toll. His hair had turned silver, and his once quick hands had grown slower. Yet his spirit burned just as fiercely as ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the New Mexico mountains, Elfego sat with an old friend on a porch overlooking the desert. They talked about how much the world had changed, how the gunfighters were gone, the towns were growing, and the land he had once fought to protect now belonged to a new generation. His friend asked him if he ever missed the old days. Elfego took a long breath, looked out at the fading light, and said quietly, "Sometimes, but those days had too much pain. I'm glad I lived to see peace." Then he smiled and added, "But if it ever disappears again, I hope someone else will have the courage to fight for it." As night fell, his thoughts drifted to the people he had helped, the poor families he defended in court, the children who now went to school, the quiet towns that no longer feared gunfire. In his heart, he knew it had all been worth it. The newspapers still wrote about him. The legend of the man who couldn't be killed refused to fade. But Elfego didn't see himself as immortal. He knew he was just a man, one who had been lucky enough to live long enough to make a difference. He once said in an interview, "If people remember me at all, I hope they remember that I fought so others wouldn't have to." That was the truth behind the myth. It wasn't the bullets he dodged or the gunfights he survived that made Elfego Baca remarkable. It was his heart. The unshakable belief that justice belonged to everyone. As the wind swept through the desert and the stars rose over the land he had helped tame, Elfego sat quietly, watching the horizon. The world had changed, but his story, the story of a fearless young man who stood against impossible odds, was now a part of it forever. The boy from Socorro had become a symbol of the New Mexico spirit, brave, proud, and unbreakable. And though time would eventually take his body, it could never take his legend. The man who couldn't be killed had already become something even stronger, a man who could never be forgotten. By the time Elfego Baca reached his later years, he had lived many lives. Lawman, lawyer, marshal, politician, and legend. Yet, no matter how far he went, he never forgot where it all began. A small, dusty town and a promise to protect those who could not protect themselves. New Mexico had changed since his youth. The lawless plains that once echoed with gunfire were now lined with quiet ranches, schools, and train tracks. The days of the Wild West were fading into memory, but Elfego's name still carried weight. In towns across the state, people spoke of him in both awe and gratitude. To some, he was a hero. To others, a mystery. But to everyone, he was living proof that one man could stand against an entire world of injustice and survive. Even as the territory grew into statehood, Elfego remained active. He advised sheriffs, mentored young lawyers, and spoke at public gatherings. When he walked into a room, people still fell silent. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash his badge. Respect followed him like a shadow. Though many saw only the legend, those close to him saw the man behind it, older now, thoughtful, and sometimes quiet. The weight of his memories never left him. The gunfights, the trials, the long nights on horseback, the faces of those he saved and those he lost, they lived with him. Yet he carried them not with regret but with pride. He often spoke about courage, but he never called himself brave. He said courage was not about being fearless. It was about doing what was right, even when fear stood in your way. I wasn't born brave, he would say. I just got tired of watching good people suffer. As time went on, Elfego turned more to storytelling. Journalists visited him, eager to hear the true tale behind the man who couldn't be killed. Some of them expected a larger-than-life figure, a man who spoke like a movie hero. But Elfego spoke plainly, with humor and humility. He laughed at his own legend, saying, "They make me sound like I was bulletproof. Truth is, I just ducked at the right time." Yet when he spoke of justice, his voice grew serious. He warned that law and order meant nothing if they weren't built on fairness. The law must serve the people, he said, not the other way around. He believed that the real danger was not gunmen, but corruption, men who use power to hurt the weak. That was the battle he had fought his whole life, and it was the one he wanted the next generation to continue. By then, stories about Elfego had already become legends. Children grew up hearing about the siege in Frisco, about the fearless young deputy who faced 80 gunmen and walked away unharmed. To them, he was like a figure out of myth, part human, part spirit. Teachers used his story to inspire courage, and parents used it to remind their children that honor mattered more than strength. In 1958, more than a decade after his death, Disney would immortalize him in a television series called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca. But even while he lived, people treated his story like folklore. When visitors met him, they were surprised to find not a towering gunfighter, but a man of average height, calm eyes, and a quiet smile. He would shake their hands, listen to their stories, and remind them that heroes are made from choices, not legends. Even as age slowed his step, Elfego's mind remained sharp. He spent his later years in Albuquerque, still surrounded by people who sought his advice. Whenever young officers asked him how to stay brave, he told them, "It's not about not dying. It's about living with purpose." He sometimes joked about the old stories that exaggerated his life. "They say I was shot at 4,000 times, he'd laugh. Maybe it was 3,999. Then his expression would turn thoughtful, and he'd add, "But I suppose numbers don't matter. What matters is that I never ran." Even in his final years, he was still called upon to mediate disputes, guide new officials, and remind people of the values that had built New Mexico. He represented a bridge between two worlds, the wild, untamed past and the modern, lawful present. His presence alone reminded people of how far the territory had come. But Elfego also understood that legends can fade if their lessons are forgotten. He once told a group of young lawmen, "You'll never need to fight like I did, and that's good. But never forget why I fought. Justice doesn't stay alive by itself. It lives only if someone keeps standing up for it." As the twilight of his life approached, Elfego spent more time with his family and friends, telling stories around warm fires, his eyes still sharp with humor. He spoke of the desert, the silence after battle, the faces of those who found hope because one man refused to give up. He spoke of peace and how he had finally found it, not in the courtroom or the gunfight, but in knowing that his life had meant something. When people asked him if he feared death, he shook his head. "I've met death before," he said. "He's not so bad once you stand your ground." Elfego Baca passed away in 1945 at the age of 80. He died not on a battlefield, but in peace, surrounded by the land he had helped protect. Newspapers across the Southwest mourned him as a hero, a symbol of justice, and a man who had shaped the identity of New Mexico itself. His funeral was filled with lawmen, politicians, and everyday people, men and women whose lives he had touched without ever meeting them. The coffin carried a simple engraving, Elfego Baca, lawman, lawyer, legend. And though his body was laid to rest, his story was far from over. Every gunfighter tale, every movie, every book about courage in the Old West still carries a shadow of his spirit. the boy from Socorro who faced the impossible and won. Elfego Baca didn't just survive the Wild West, he helped civilize it. And even now, his name stands as a promise that courage, justice, and dignity can outlive any bullet. Long after Elfego Baca's death, his legend refused to fade. The name Elfego echoed through New Mexico like a proud memory, spoken in classrooms, whispered in barrooms, printed in newspapers, and passed down around dinner tables. He was no longer just a man who survived 4,000 bullets. He had become a symbol of strength, justice, and pride for an entire people. In the years following his passing, stories about him spread across the United States. Some told of the fearless lawman who faced 80 cowboys alone. Others spoke of the sharp lawyer who defended the poor. A few exaggerated his deeds, turning him into a near-mythical figure. But those who truly knew his life understood something deeper. Elfego Baca wasn't great because he was invincible. He was great because he stood for something when no one else would. The Wild West was gone now, but the lessons he left behind still mattered. As New Mexico grew into modern America, many of the challenges Elfego had fought against, injustice, inequality, and prejudice, remained in different forms. To the people who remembered him, his story wasn't just history. It was a message that courage and conscience were timeless weapons. In 1958, more than a decade after his death, Walt Disney introduced his story to the world in a television miniseries called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca. For millions of Americans, this was their first glimpse into the life of the man who couldn't be killed. The show portrayed him as a fearless and clever hero, a man who outsmarted his enemies instead of simply outgunning them. It was one of the first times a Mexican-American hero had been given such recognition on national television. Families across the country watched a character who wasn't just brave, but intelligent, disciplined, and proud of his heritage. To many young Hispanic viewers, it was more than entertainment. It was representation. For the first time, someone who looked like them stood tall on screen, not as a villain or a sidekick, but as the hero of his own story. Elfego's legend became part of the cultural identity of New Mexico. Schools, libraries, and historical societies honored him as a founding figure of law and justice in the territory. His name appeared in textbooks and documentaries. Streets were named after him. Songs were written in his memory. And every generation found new meaning in his courage. Historians often debated which parts of his story were fact and which were legend. Did the cowboys really fire 4,000 bullets? Could any man truly survive such odds? Some researchers claimed the number was exaggerated. Others insisted it was true. But in the end, the truth was bigger than the numbers. The heart of the story was undeniable. Elfego Baca had faced death without fear and lived to tell the tale. Beyond his legend as a gunfighter, scholars began to focus on his contributions as a leader and advocate. They uncovered records of his cases as a defense attorney, where he stood up for minorities in an era when few others dared. They found speeches he had given, letters he had written, and policies he had helped shape. Proof that his mind was as sharp as his aim. One historian wrote, Elfego Baca's greatest weapon was not his gun, but his sense of justice. Through the decades, his story inspired countless writers, filmmakers, and artists. His name became shorthand for bravery, the man who refused to back down, no matter the odds. Even in a changing world, his message remained clear. Justice is worth standing for, even if you have to stand alone. In his home state, his legacy took on an even deeper meaning. For New Mexicans of Hispanic descent, Elfego represented pride, a reminder that their history was not just one of hardship, but of courage and leadership. In a land where cultures blended, his story bridged the gap between the Mexican and American worlds. He had lived through a time of transition and proved that honor could exist in both languages, both histories, both hearts. Tourists who visit New Mexico today still find traces of his presence. In the small town of Reserve, where the famous gunfight took place, the old site of the Frisco shootout remains a local landmark. There's a plaque that reads, "Here, Elfego Baca faced 80 cowboys and lived." His courage changed the story of the West. Every year, historians and storytellers gather there to retell his story, not just as entertainment, but as heritage. Some come to honor his bravery, others to remember the man who fought for equality long before it was fashionable. And though the world has changed, his lessons still hold true. He taught that real strength comes from conviction, not power. That a man's worth is measured not by his victories, but by his reasons for fighting. And that justice is not a gift. It's something you earn, one act of courage at a time. Elfego Baca once said, "I didn't want to be known as a killer. I wanted to be known as a man who made the law respected." That simple wish came true. Today, more than a century after the Frisco siege, his spirit lives on, in the hearts of those who still believe that a single person's courage can change the course of history. His story reminds us that every time we stand up against injustice, we carry a piece of his legacy with us. Elfego Baca may have been called the man who couldn't be killed, but in truth, he was something even greater, the man who refused to be silenced. And as long as courage still finds a home in the hearts of the brave, the legend of Elfego Baca will never die. As the decades passed, the world continued to move forward, but the story of Elfego Baca only grew stronger. His name became a bridge between history and legend, a reminder of what true courage looks like, even when the world around you seems lost. By the mid-20th century, America had changed. The frontier days were gone, the guns of the Wild West had gone silent, and new generations were more likely to ride in cars than on horses. Yet somehow the spirit of Elfego Baca still spoke to people. He wasn't just remembered as a gunfighter or a lawyer. He had become a symbol of integrity, of pride, and of standing tall in the face of injustice. In towns all over New Mexico, people continued to tell his story. They spoke of the boy from Socorro who dared to challenge 80 armed men and walked away alive. They spoke of the young deputy who pinned his badge on not for power, but for purpose. They spoke of the lawyer who defended those who had no one else to speak for them. His life became more than history. It became a mirror for anyone who had ever felt small in the face of overwhelming odds. Even those who weren't born in New Mexico came to respect him. His name began appearing in history books across the United States. Schools and community centers taught about his bravery as an example of real American heroism, not the kind born from fame or wealth, but from conviction and heart. For many Mexican Americans, Elfego became a cultural hero. He represented pride, strength, and resilience, proof that courage and intelligence could open doors that prejudice tried to close. In a time when Hispanic figures were rarely celebrated in history, Elfego's story was a light that refused to dim. He showed that a man's worth isn't decided by where he's from, but by what he stands for. As more historians studied his life, they discovered how much more there was to him than the famous gunfight. The Frisco siege had made him a legend, but his true greatness came from what he did afterward, building a legacy of justice, education, and equality. He lived long enough to see his people begin to earn the respect he had fought for. That, perhaps, was his greatest victory. In Albuquerque, where he spent his later years, people often stopped by his home to visit him. Neighbors described him as kind, sharp-minded, and full of humor, even in his old age. Children would gather to hear him tell stories, not about killing or violence, but about courage, honesty, and doing what's right. When asked about fear, he would smile and say, "Fear's a guest you never invite twice." He had lived through so much danger that death itself no longer frightened him. He often said that living without purpose was worse than dying. "Every man dies once," he said, "but cowards die a little every day." When Elfego passed away in 1945, the people of New Mexico mourned deeply. His funeral was a quiet affair, but filled with emotion. Lawmen, lawyers, judges, ranchers, and ordinary townsfolk came together to say goodbye. They didn't just bury a man. They laid to rest a piece of their own history. Newspapers across the Southwest published tributes, calling him the last lawman of the Wild West and the man who brought justice to New Mexico. But even as they wrote his obituary, they knew his story wasn't over. Because legends don't end, they evolve. In the years that followed, his name continued to live on. The Disney series The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca brought his story to a national audience, inspiring new generations. Writers and filmmakers found themselves drawn to his life, the perfect blend of danger, honor, and heart. But the real power of his story wasn't in Hollywood or books. It was in the way people remembered him. Every time someone stood up for what was right, every time a person fought for fairness in a world that didn't seem to care, Elfego's spirit lived again. He had become more than a lawman. He was a lesson. A lesson about bravery, integrity, and the idea that one person can change the course of history by refusing to bow to fear. Modern historians now describe Elfego Baca as one of the most influential figures in the transformation of New Mexico from a rough frontier into a civilized state. He bridged two eras, the chaotic lawlessness of the Old West and the dawn of a lawful united territory. His courage became part of the foundation on which modern New Mexico was built. And though time has softened the details, the heart of his story remains as sharp as ever. A young man, alone, standing against impossible odds, not for glory but for justice. Today, visitors still travel to Reserve, New Mexico, where the old adobe house once stood. They walk the same ground where Elfego made his stand, where the air once cracked with gunfire, and they feel something powerful. The presence of a man who proved that true strength doesn't come from the size of your weapon, but from the size of your will. Every bullet that missed him became part of his legend. Every act of courage became part of his legacy. And every person inspired by his story became proof that his fight was never in vain. Elfego Baca's life reminds the world that no matter how dark the times may seem, courage can light the way. He showed that one person's bravery can echo for centuries, louder than any gunshot, stronger than any fear. And so, even as the years go by and the Wild West fades further into history, the legend of the man who couldn't be killed continues to ride across the deserts of New Mexico, a timeless echo of courage that will never be silenced. In the decades that followed, Elfego Baca's story transcended time, growing from a regional legend into a tale that embodied the true spirit of the American frontier. Generations that never heard a single gunshot of the Wild West still felt his presence, in the stories told by their grandparents, in the streets that bore his name, and in the belief that courage could still make a difference in the world. His life became more than a record of events. It became a lesson passed down like scripture. Teachers told their students about the man who faced 80 armed cowboys and never flinched. Historians described him as a bridge between chaos and order, a man who helped transform New Mexico from a land of violence into a land of law. To the people, though, he was something even simpler, proof that justice can come from ordinary people who refuse to bow to fear. Time softened the edges of the stories. The numbers, 4,000 bullets, 80 cowboys, 36 hours, became less important than what they meant. What mattered was that a 19-year-old boy had once stood alone and said, "Enough." That single word had changed his world. And through the years, it continued to echo. As the 20th century moved forward, the myth of Elfego Baca found new life in books, films, and classrooms. His tale wasn't just about the Old West anymore. It was about identity and resilience. He represented a voice for those who had been forgotten in the pages of history, the Mexican Americans, the working class, the ones who built the frontier with their hands but rarely had their names remembered. In a world that often glorified outlaws and gunmen, Elfego stood as the opposite. A man who believed that true power came not from violence, but from conviction. He carried a gun, yes, but he carried principle first. Even Disney's portrayal of him in The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca captured this truth, that he was not just a fighter, but a thinker, a man who valued fairness above all else. Over time, people began to see his story not just as entertainment, but as heritage. In small towns across New Mexico, murals appeared showing Elfego standing tall, dust swirling around his boots, his badge shining in the sun. Festivals celebrated his legacy, and every generation rediscovered what he stood for. The house where he made his famous stand in Reserve became a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of what a single act of courage could mean. Even historians who tried to separate the man from the myth found themselves inspired. They wrote that Elfego Baca symbolized something timeless, the idea that one person, no matter how young or outnumbered, can stand for what is right and change the course of history. And perhaps that's why his legend never died. Because Elfego's story wasn't about bullets or bravery alone. It was about belief. He believed that justice belonged to everyone, that respect had no color, and that no one should live in fear. Those beliefs turned him from a local lawman into a universal hero. Today, his spirit still lives on in the land he loved. His name appears in museums, his face on murals, his words in classrooms. Tourists walk through the deserts of New Mexico, feeling the same dry wind that once brushed against his hat. And they whisper his story. Elfego Baca's life reminds us that heroes aren't born in comfort. They're forged in struggle. He wasn't perfect, but he was real. He made mistakes, but he never broke his promise to stand up for the helpless. More than a century later, his legacy continues to teach one simple truth. You don't have to be unkillable to be unforgettable. You just have to stand your ground. Elfego Baca may have died in 1945, but the world never stopped telling his story. And as long as there are people who believe in fairness, courage, and honor, the man who couldn't be killed will live forever, not in gunfire, but in the hearts of those who still dare to do what's right.